now called the Connecticut River, from present Enfield to Connecticut to the Holyoke Range. For at least 10,000 years since the last era of glaciation, the Agawam people engaged in trade, diplomacy, and kinship with other regional indigenous people, most notably the Quabog to the east, the Podunk to the south, the Waranoka to the west, and the Nonantuck, Pocumtuck, and Sokoke to the north. During the 1630s, when Agawam leaders invited English colonial settlers to build a small settlement here in Springfield, they attempted to preserve in written deeds indigenous cartographies and rights to hunt, fish, plant, and live on tribal lands. When diplomatic relations failed, the Agawam people were decimated and dispersed as a direct result of colonial deceit. I forgot to hit record and my host didn't help. Okay, I just started recording. Sorry. When diplomatic relations failed, the Agawam people were decimated and dispersed as a direct result of colonial deceit, disease, and warfare. Although the survivors sought refuge with other Native communities across the Northeast, very few direct descendants of the Agawam people live in Springfield today. I acknowledge, however, that many indigenous nations from the territory we now call Southern New England still survive and exercise sovereignty. I acknowledge in particular these contemporary indigenous nations, the Nipmuc Nation and Chubungamog Nipmuc to the east, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, the Mashpee Wampanoag, and the Narragansett to the southeast, the Mohegan Eastern Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, and the Scaticoke to the south, and the Stockbridge Munsee Mohegan to the west, and the Abenaki to the north, among others. Recognizing that the entirety of the North American continent constitutes territory considered to be original indigenous homelands, I respect the sovereignty of these and hundreds of other Native American nations that survive today. And I pledge to support the rights of these nations and the interests of indigenous peoples. So that's the acknowledgement. I am going to mostly focus on stereotypes, but the first thing I want to do is say a little bit about tribal nation sovereignty. So many people in the United States that are not Native think of Native Americans as a racial category similar to other racial groups or categories in the United States. But Native people are different because of tribal nation sovereignty. What does that mean? In a kind of simplistic sense, it means that tribes are political entities, okay, that self-govern as do other nations. Native nations, and there are over 570 federally recognized Native nations, determine their own political system, and it's not always a chief with everybody underneath. There's a variety of political systems, determine their own laws, determine their own criminal justice system. Many tribal nations have court systems, their own school systems, their own healthcare systems, etc. Native nations also determine citizenship, and they do that. They have a variety of different systems for doing that. Not all tribal nations do that the same. And a lot of Native people, not all, don't trust only self-identification as Native. They look to see whether people are enrolled or at least have substantial involvement in their Native nation, engaged in cultural practices and community events and supporting the nation in other ways. There are, of course, people outside enrolled Native nations that have Native ancestry. Many of these people are legitimately tied to Native tribal nations, but some of them are not, okay? There's people who claim Native identity or ancestry who don't actually have it. Despite Native nations having sovereignty, there are many challenges Native nations face in enacting this sovereignty. And those barriers come from the US government, state governments, and just citizens in general that are non-Native. So the most important thing, I think, this is me speaking, people need to know is they need to learn about sovereignty of Native nations and support that sovereignty. So we are now going to start on the topic. And this is where I want you to write. So get a pencil or a pen. And I'm going to have you write things. I'm going to type what I want you to write. I'm going to give, you're going to do 4 of these writing activities. And I'm going to give you about 45 seconds for each one. And then we'll talk about why I'm having you doing this. But before we do this, is everybody ready to write? Can't see most of you, okay. But okay, so you're gonna first write, and when I say stop writing on that one, okay? So you're first gonna write about movies with Native characters, Native American characters, not Native Indigenous people from Australia or that kind of thing. So ready, go. Okay, stop. Now I'm going to give you something else. I am an actual old-fashioned person with a wristwatch with a second hand. Okay. So now I'm going to have you write the names of television shows with reoccurring, not guest, Native characters. I'm typing this into the chat. So television shows with reoccurring Native characters. Go. Okay, stop. Okay, so now we're going to do 2 more. Okay, so now I'm going to have you do famous deceased, as in dead, Native Americans. Okay, ready? Go. Okay, stop. All right, last one. I bet you can guess what it is. Famous living Native Americans. Ready? Go. Okay, stop. Okay. I want a little later, you're going to be typing some of your answers into the chat. But for right now, I just want to say that your capacity to answer these questions and list things is influenced by multiple things. Of course, our memory, because all of us, you know, can't remember our best friend's name sometimes, especially when we're being timed. But also it's influenced by the degree to which we have exposed ourselves to particular information or particular types of representations. But perhaps more than that, or at least as much as that, it's influenced by what has been in mainstream US culture and what has been excluded from mainstream US culture that impacts what we're exposed to, right? And to obtain a really good set of answers on all of these questions, you would probably have to be involved in Native communities, Native education, Native activism, and that kind of thing. So I just want to first touch base on numbers, like how many were you able to name? And this can be a little embarrassing, but let's just try to be honest with ourselves, because one of the ways that we need to work through things is through figuring out what we don't know and that sort of thing. So right now, type into the chat, how many of you, the number of, and I want you to judge yourself, like, is it really accurate that that television show had a reoccurring Native character? Or do you really know that this particular living person is Native American? Okay, so type in the number of movies that you listed. Just anybody. And for some people, it's 0, probably, for all of these things. Okay, all right. Not everybody, you don't have to do this if you don't want. Type in, okay, so now type in the number of television shows with reoccurring characters that you are sure you accurately listed. I'm later going to have you type in actual names. Notice that people knew, if you're looking at the chat right now, people knew movies more than they know television shows with reoccurring characters, which totally makes sense, given some stats I'll tell you in a bit. Now type in the number of famous deceased Native Americans that you put, that you're sure are Native. A lot of you are quick. You're quicker than my students in getting things into the chat. Okay, now type in the number of famous living Native Americans that you're sure are Native into the chat. Okay, I'm now going to talk about the two main problems with representation and knowledge. You can see that people knew more deceased Native people than living Native people. You know what I forgot to say? I forgot to say don't use any sources. So I don't have any idea whether you did. I have a good point, Shannon. That's what I needed my hosts for, to tell me these kind of things I miss. So I did a survey that was part of the Reclaiming, multiple surveys that was part of the Reclaiming Native Truth Project with some other scholars. I was on the Stephanie Freiberg research team, and we asked this question to about 3,000, over 3,000 students at 12 colleges and universities. And we also asked this question to a sample on an online system where anybody can answer the questions. These were all people who were born in the United States. and we removed Native people from the sample. And right now we have a paper under review that's looking at two things. It's looking at the content of the answers, and it's looking at the degree to which people can answer these questions, okay? So first, I'm going to focus on the invisibility of Native people in US culture. So first of all, it's important to point out that some participants of this over 5,000 surveys did not answer this question or these questions. And the ability, the range to which they didn't answer the questions was different. On the contemporary famous living Native, famous Native people, 31% of the college students didn't fill it out, right? And then it went down to 17% on the movies, okay? So you can see that part from this, it's very likely that some of those people were just being lazy and they decided not to answer the survey questions, and other people were unable to answer the survey questions, and so they left it blank for that reason. So there's a variety of reasons why people might leave these questions blank, but at least some of them left it blank because they didn't know any answers, okay, in both samples. And then a very high percentage wrote into the blank, and they had, you know, as much time as they wanted to complete their surveys, right? They weren't timed like you were. A lot of people wrote that they didn't know any answers, and we in the directions told them not to look things up. So, but it varied by question. So the 23% wrote that they didn't know any famous deceased Native Americans, okay? 33% wrote that they didn't know any films that featured Native characters, which is surprising, 33%. Given the popularity of the Disney Pocahontas movie. 55% wrote that they didn't know any television shows with reoccurring Native characters, and 70% wrote that they didn't know any famous living Native Americans. So this, if you even consider the answers to these questions, the numbers that didn't know are actually higher than those numbers that I just reported. Because, you know, some people just didn't answer the question. And of those who knew answers, most people knew very few answers. They maybe knew one or two movies or one famous Native person that's living named Sherman Alexie, okay, who was the #1 person named of living Native people. So these findings fit with other researchers' findings. For example, Poindexter found that Native Americans are virtually invisible in 12 different community newscasts, like television newscasts, okay, across the United States, okay? They were like almost missing completely, okay, in the newscast. Freiberg detected that in films, it was 0.002%. Took a huge number of films, okay? That was the percentage that had Native characters, okay? Did I type that out right? No, 0.002. I got one extra zero in there. But you get the picture, okay? I don't know how to say this scholar's name, Tukachinsky et al. Found that 0.1% of television shows had Native characters, again, with a big, huge sample, okay? And Warner found that 24 US states out of the 50 US states do not mandate any coverage of Native Americans in the schools, while another 10 mandated really limited coverage, like you have to cover this one event or you have to cover like this thing. And so that's 34 of the 50 states without mandated coverage or without much coverage mandated. And even the states that are, I can't do the math really quickly, 26, the other states, don't necessarily have a great deal, as I'll talk about. Actually, I'll tell you right now that 87% of the coverage is prior to 1900. And there's a lot of things that happened after 1900 experienced by Native people and that involved Native people. So the first and most important point, or not the most important point, the first point is that Native people are pretty invisible in US popular culture, with the exception of mascots, okay? Right now there's about 1,500 in the United States, okay? And also sometimes consumer symbols like the names of trucks and on our baking powder and stuff like that. So now I'm going to have you type something else into the chat by category that you, the answers that you wrote down. So the first thing I'd like you to write down is living Native Americans, famous living Native Americans. I put a heading there, so just go ahead and type in. If you see somebody else typed in the same name, don't type it in. I'm just looking for the, I'm sure we'll get duplicates, but just type in the names of people. Osceola's dead. Oh, you mean a contemporary person with that name? We got people that know authors here. Okay, now how about, okay, so now, ooh, I like political figures there. Okay, so I just misspelled television, but that's okay. So now type in the names of the television shows. And again, if somebody else typed it in, you don't need to type it in, but it's going to happen that people type in. One thing that when we were coding, we excluded incorrect answers, which are things like naming movies for television shows, or people who were dead and they think are alive, but also people like also things that really aren't native. Okay, so now let's have you type in movies, movie titles. Nobody typed in Pocahontas yet. Okay, so now, okay. So now how about deceased Native Americans? Oh my gosh. Can't type any, I can't spell today. Oh, people already started typing in the deceased before I got the heading in there. Okay, so let's stop typing in, but we're gonna come back to some of the things that you typed in, okay? So what I'm gonna talk about now is the main, so now don't type into the chat. If you have a question or a comment, raise your blue hand or raise your real hand, and I might see you if you're on the first page. But I won't see you otherwise. That's why you need to use your blue hand. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the main stereotypes now. The first one, these are, what I'm naming is the actual names of the stereotypes, what scholars call them, and some activists. So the first one is the bloodthirsty savage stereotype. So this is the belief. These are all beliefs. That's what stereotypes are. They're misleading generalizations or overgeneralizations. So this is a bloodthirsty savage stereotype, is that Native Americans were fighters, warriors, like occupation number one, okay, who were aggressive and vicious, okay? And I want to talk about how this stereotype relates to US policy. If people believe or say they believe that Native Americans are all warriors, that they're all fighters, they're all aggressive, and they're absolutely brutal and vicious, okay, then this justifies genocide, right? It was used to justify murdering and killing Native people in war and in massacres, okay? It was also used to justify confining Native Americans to reservations and not letting them leave the reservation territory, which was policed by people hired by the US government or under the direction of the US government. I want to give a concrete example of this. I'm communicating with people in Athol, Massachusetts, which is not that far from here, where they have a cartoon. Their mascot is a cartoon Indian with a tomahawk and a spear, and their nickname is the Red Raiders. And raiders are people that invade in a violent way, and they steal things, but they also conquer, pillage, okay? And the real history of the United States, it is about white raiders, white colonial raiders. And yet all across the United States, the mascots are named after this stereotype, okay? Mascots are often picked to depict aggression and physical power and fighting, right? So there's animals that are perceived to be like that, and there's tons of Native mascots, okay? And they usually are a warrior or a chief that's supposedly leading warriors, and they're associated with aggression. And so, but there aren't the white raiders, okay? Which is really what the history of the United States is about, because Native people, when they were violent related to whites, it was in defense, okay, and protecting land and lives, okay? So I want us to think about, related to this, in addition, US military weapon systems are often named after Native Americans. And when the US went in to take out bin Laden, they called that Operation Geronimo, okay? And so, but lots of weapon systems are named. So you've got this association of violence and physical force with Native Americans. Throughout US culture, it's still here, right? Even though this is a stereotype. So when we look at the answers that you put into the chat, how many of those answers were about that fit this stereotype? In many of, when we observe, for example, the listing of famous deceased Native Americans, many of them are warriors or chiefs who led their tribal nations in the past, against US military forces. or French military forces. Many of the movies depict Native Americans in this way, okay? So it's important to kind of look at that. It's not that common for the television shows to have that stereotype, and certainly not common among contemporary living Native people, some of whom are in the military, but most are not using any physical force fighting, okay? So that's the first stereotype. The second main stereotype is the noble, and again, I'm using the term of the scholars here, the noble savage, or the noble Indian, or the romantic Indian. Okay, there's a lot of parts of this stereotype. So for this stereotype, first of all, the reason why savage is in there is they're not considered violent, according to this stereotype, but they're considered primitive and simplistic, okay? So having like this simple, uncomplex kind of culture that's not modern, that's like all traditional. They're considered, and related to that, they're considered in touch with nature, like one with nature, okay? Therefore not connected to aspects of the contemporary time period, even though obviously we still have nature. So they're also considered childlike, according to this stereotype. So, you know, there's a similar stereotype of African Americans in the past as like childlike, jovial, okay? But this is, you know, simplistic, childlike, doesn't quite understand reality. Also spiritual, like everything is perceived to be like about spirituality. And also this stereotype is often enjoyed and appreciated by non-Native people, especially whites, because these, according to this stereotype, Native people are supportive of whites, right? Including supportive of colonists. So some of the things that you typed into the chat fit this. So Squanto, that's not the real name of this person, you know, assisted whites, the way that Pocahontas is portrayed, not necessarily the reality, is assisting whites. The way that Massasoit, also not the full name, is portrayed is assisting whites, like supporting colonists, okay? And so many of the movies also have characters, and some of the famous living Native people, I mean, deceased Native people, also fit this stereotype. And I want to talk about how, like, the way that Native people are portrayed, especially past Native people, isn't necessarily realistic. In many cases, it's not realistic. Okay, so Massasoit was making concrete decisions to keep his people alive and was negotiating these really complex things, right? And then he got stabbed in the back, okay? And so, but he wasn't like, you know, trying to make friends just to be friendly and to like merge into white American society or white colonial society. And so you can see some people, there's less of this with obviously living, famous living Native Americans. There's less of this with the television shows, although it is in a lot of television shows. For example, in, what was that show called? Dr. Medicine Woman, something like that, okay. But let's talk about how this stereotype is related to US policy, because these stereotypes, all of these stereotypes justify harmful US policies. And I talked already about how the bloodthirsty savage justified genocide and justified moving people to reservations and not letting them leave. So this stereotype justified US control, because if Native people are seen as childlike and primitive, then the white people who are seen as civilized and mature, okay, quote unquote, should control them. So we have the US government exerting control over Native nations, and this continues to this day, okay? We have white school systems run by white people imposed on Native people. We have white religious leaders who have no respect for Native spiritualities of a variety of sorts, and are trying to convert to dominant forms of Christianity. Also, assimilation policies, because if they're childlike and they're primitive and so forth, then we need to teach them, we meaning the colonists or white Americans, teach them Native ways, right? I mean, white ways. And this included forcing children to, Native families and their children to have Native children go into boarding schools. It included the imposition of Christianity, okay? It included the Dawes Act that resulted in where the purpose of this act was to convert Native people into farmers that were little capitalists, so they would try to make a profit, and they would have individually owned farms. And so the land was taken and divided into small plots. This resulted in Native people losing 2/3 of their land because of this assimilationist policy, when there was lots of extra land for whites, of course. In the 50s, so this is much more recent, a policy that's based on this stereotype was the termination policy, where over 100 Native nations had their sovereignty revoked. They were disbanded and not recognized by the US government anymore, because they were seen as primitive, unable to control things, and childlike, right? And well, at least that was the justification for it, okay? So I also want to talk about how this stereotype operates today. It is alive and well, okay? And the premise that there were these Native people who were like supporting white colonists, okay, makes non-Native people like me and other non-Native people feel less guilty about colonization. And when we feel less guilty about the horrific processes of colonization that continue up to this period, then we are less apt to make efforts to support Native nation interests and Native people's interests. So if we think, oh, well, you know, those Native people were supporting us, okay? Also, this is a very romantic stereotype. Oh, Justin, go ahead.
Laurel, we have.
I just wanted to add, like in terms of termination, one of the most recent aspects of that happened here in Massachusetts with the Trump administration trying to terminate the land grant, the land that had been taken in trust for the Mashpee Wampanoag people. The argument had been that the Wampanoags, who pretty much everybody in American education learns about, the ones that met the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving and all that, even though that story is a little odd, were in a legal designation. The argument was made that they were not Indians at the time of the law that was passed that said reservations and land could be taken into trust for Native people. This was a lawsuit that was brought by non-natives who also wanted to have a casino in the same area as the Native folks who had the land in Taunton. So this was just, it's still in court, with the most recent decision about a portion of the case was earlier this year. I think it was in maybe June or May or June this year. So just that people understand that, again, that this is ongoing behaviors, not just something that sort of happens solely in a historical context.
Thank you, Justin. Justin could be teaching this workshop himself and teaching other workshops, but they were looking for Springfield College volunteers, and that's why you have me. Another part of this stereotype is, you know, you run into non-native people who say things like, I love American Indians, okay? And so there's like this little romantic stuff where people, and what they love is they love this stereotype, and they love the messages about this stereotype. And so they do things like consume pseudo-native culture and sometimes actual native culture, and engage in a lot of cultural appropriation, right? Things like making their own dream catchers, displaying them, or making little figurines that you can get of you know, cats with headdresses on, and putting those around the house. And so this is, you know, it offends a lot of Native people that that their culture, like, not only is land taken and lives taken and political control taken, but sometimes Native identity is taken, right? And people pretend they're Indians, okay? And take aspects of real Native culture or fake culture, pseudo, what we call Hollywood culture. It's nice to thank Justin, but I ask people not to put stuff into the chat, okay? Because I'm using the chat. So, okay, so another common stereotype is the broken or degraded Indian. You can make comments, but raise your blue hand. Justin, do you still have a comment? Okay. Justin, the broken or degraded Indian. So this stereotype is less common in the Northeast than in some other parts of the US, but this stereotype should sound like, because it is like, the stereotypes that exist of African Americans and Latinx people in the United States. It's the stereotype that all Native people are poor, they're lazy, and that's why they're poor, okay? They have criminal tendencies, they have bad family values, okay? These are the stereotypes. In addition, for Native people, it's a stereotype that they're alcoholics, all alcoholics. And so this stereotype is, let me just say one thing about the alcoholics. The alcoholism rate among Native people is only a little higher than it is for some other groups, including white groups, okay? But let me just say that this stereotype for all those groups, whether it's African Americans, Latinx people, or Native Americans, you know, justifies doing absolutely nothing about material issues faced by Native people or African American people, or because it's basically saying, you just are so bad people, you have bad culture, so therefore we should do nothing. Or if it's believed that all these groups, including Native people, have bad culture and values and so forth, then we've got the white savior complex, where white people think that they have good culture, and so they then go into Black, Latinx, and Native communities, and they think they're gonna like save them by transforming their cultural ways. So this stereotype is not common in the representations that exist. But if you live in particular parts of the country, you will see this a lot in the news and the nonfiction media. And it's a common belief among non-Native people. Okay, so I recently had a study published related to this stereotype. The casino Indian stereotype. And this stereotype is in some of the things that you typed in there, most in particular, some of the comedy shows, especially the animated comedy shows. that show and feature Native characters. What it is the stereotype that Native people are rich, and this is connected to the Mashpee, the perception of what's going on with Mashpee that Justin was talking about, that Native people are all rich, when in fact, right, Native people have amongst the highest poverty rates compared to other racial and ethnic groups, that they're greedy, they just want more and more money, okay, which is, you know, flies in the face of colonization when white people were taking Native land, and that they're manipulative. They're pretending, this is also related to the Mashpee case. People like President Trump have accused the Mashpee and the Pequot of not being real Indians, and they're manipulating people, right, to think certain things and manipulating people to get their money, okay? So let me just talk about a few facts related to this stereotype. So less than half of Native nations, or about half, operate casinos. Most casinos are somewhat profitable, but not that profitable. There are 2 around here that are the most profitable ones in the nation. This stereotype is also related to lack of knowledge about sovereignty, because a lot of people think that they don't know that Native people are have tribal nation sovereignty, and so they think that it's unfair, okay, that Native people can operate casinos in some places where non-Native people can't. And they also don't know that these are not businesses that are for personal profit. These are tribal businesses, and it's not just casinos. It can be a hotel business. It can be truck stops. It can be the fishing industry, okay, part of the fishing industry. They're tribally owned business, and the money gets plowed right back into the tribe for people's benefits, for housing and so forth. And there's now research findings that shows that tribally owned or Native nation owned businesses are beneficial. They are reducing the poverty rates for folks that have successful Native nation businesses. Also, this stereotype, you know how I was talking about the last stereotype, the broken, degraded one, that one being related to you know, stereotypes associated with Latinx and African Americans. This stereotype is associated with actually some other groups without the casino in it. So when groups appear to be moving up the economic ladder, many whites in US society are threatened by that. So when Jewish people started to move up the economic ladder, when Japanese Americans started to move up the economic ladder, or even were perceived as doing that, okay, they get perceived as a threat, and they get perceived as greedy, as manipulative, as crafty, okay? So this stereotype is also related to some other groups, and just because Native Americans, who have an enormous poverty rate, are like starting to improve themselves, now they're gonna get targeted with this casino Indian stereotype. And this stereotype—
Laura, we have another hand.
Oh, good, thank you. Felicia.
We kind of passed it a little bit when you were talking about sovereignty, and I was just thinking of and sort of the political side of things. And one of the things that I don't know, you know, if folks are following, but I know Justin had posted this in the 5 College Consortium for Facebook, but the North Dakota laws are making it really challenging for Indigenous natives to vote based on addresses, right? So many, as you were talking about sort of casinos, businesses, and I think of reservations, I think, you know, addresses, and a lot of folks are using PO boxes. And so I don't know if that's something you're going to talk about either, but that's another way in terms of how the inequities are impacting disproportionately Native and Indigenous communities.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I know I'm doing a lot of talking, so jump in if you have good examples like Felicia and Justin did. The also, there's been Native nations that have tried to prevent COVID from spreading, that have exerted their rights to sovereignty to kind of police their borders. So just not anybody can come in and do whatever they want on the reservation. They've been having to fight state governors and other folks to be able to protect their own people when they have that right, legally. I just want to say that my own study recently found that there's a relationship between belief in the stereotype and opposition to tribal nation sovereignty. So it's important to think about that. I want to talk about two other stereotypes, and then we'll get into discrimination. One of the most common ones is this one. Native Americans are a people of the past. When, many times I've heard people say, they used to be. In fact, sometimes this is said in front of Native people who are like right there and they're like, hello, I'm here, okay? So Native people are relatively invisible in US popular culture. And what we have is stereotypes of Native people from the past and invisibility of contemporary Native people. So I think I mentioned that 87% of the curriculum is before 1900, and we've just been talking about some things that are going on right now, or termination that happened in the 50s, which is, after 1900. So this is a huge problem. And that's why people can't name contemporary Native people. And unlike a lot of movies, most television shows are set in the contemporary period, right? And so that's one of the reasons why there's a you don't see contemporary Native people in the mainstream. There's wonderful stuff outside the mainstream in all of these categories, of course. So I think some of your answers are related to, or ability to answer is related to that. Another one is the kind of, can't type and talk.
We have two answers.
What? Okay.
We have two answers.
Okay, let me pause, Felicia, and then Justin.
I think I didn't unraise my hand. That was from before, so
Okay.
I don't have anything.
Justin, go ahead.
I just wanted to bring up, in terms of the idea of Native people, us being relics of the past, so to speak. I think it's also very prominent in modern ways in the idea that when I meet people and I tell them I'm Native, they say, how much? Because in their head, you have to fit a certain phenotype, or they have to have an idea of a certain amount of blood to qualify as a Native person. I'm Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. My people are from the Great Lakes area and up into Canada. Specifically, I have ancestors that live in Garden River. I speak some of the language. I'm a traditional singer. I was a traditional dancer for years. I MC powwows. I participate in the culture every day. But because I don't look like the quintessential Indian from your 8th grade social studies book, people have a hard time wrapping their mind around the fact that I'm Native. There's also this aspect where people don't understand that we as Anishinaabe people didn't see this division of like your blood quantum. You were Anishinaabe and whatever else. You weren't, part. So it was A plus B, not A divided by B. You're either Anishinaabe or you are not. Whatever else you are is a bonus, a continuation of that. It's not sort of the separation of yourself as a whole cultural being into smaller parts. And I think that that's something, the idea of blood quantum, that affects people's ability to see us in contemporary ways. Our cultures have evolved, And just because people don't understand how our cultures have evolved doesn't mean that we're stuck in the past. So I just wanted to, add that. Hopefully that gives people a little bit of insight.
Yeah, that's great. And anybody else who wants to jump in, if they have good examples, that would be terrific. One of my co-authors, Stephanie Freiberg, is Talulip from the Washington State. And when she gives presentations, at least sometimes, she does not dress in traditional, Indian native clothes associated with her tribal nation. She wears dress-up clothes that are pretty common for college professors, except for me, who dresses down. And she goes, do I look like your stereotype? This is what Native people look like. This is what Native people do. We are professors, we are mail carriers, we are, fill in the blank. But because people have this stereotype of not only Native people of being from the past, but looking like this stereotype warrior chief or something, that they have trouble recognizing or even thinking about Native people being in their environment. The last stereotype, and then I'm going to move into actions, are the notion that there's a single Native American culture, and Hollywood has created this myth, and there's kind of jokes about it, that Hollywood Native culture, it's like this mishmash of things from a few Native cultures with this stuff that doesn't even exist at all in any Native culture, like bundled together, and there it is, okay? People don't distinguish culturally between Native nations that have very different cultures. And so I constantly hear people say the phrase Native culture, okay, as if there's a single one. And so we need to kind of work on that, but you can see this in a lot of the television shows, in a lot of the portrayals in movies, this kind of homogenous culture. So that's it for the stereotypes. And what I wanted to shift into now is why they are or how is a better question, they are harmful. And so one way is they contribute to microaggressions, which are small things that trickle down every day or almost every day, in this case, into Native people's lives, where like it's a little stab, another little stab, another little stab, and it can result in a lot of stress. And being angry, I get angry and I'm not even Native. Things like the Connecticut Valley that we live in being referred to as the Pioneer Valley, which I hear all the time. What that does is it's referring to colonists. It erases the presence of Native people historically and today in this valley. And it's actually celebrating colonization, because that's who were perceived as the pioneers. Another example are tons of expressions, one being low man on the totem pole. The totem pole is, important to some Northwestern tribal nations, to their culture. And totem poles, I'm not going to get into details related to totem poles, but it's not a hierarchy where the people or images at the bottom are considered unimportant. In fact, some of the images at the bottom and the figures at the bottom are the most important foundation, right? And so this kind of borrowing and distorting through language, the cultural appropriation itself, okay, whether it's via mascots or via figurines or other types of Native symbolism, is, it's offensive kind of on a daily basis. Or how people talk about things and leave out Native people. That's often offensive. So there's lots of microaggressions. There's also what sociologists call individual discrimination, which is different than structural barriers. Individual discrimination is when usually a person with a prejudice or a stereotype like treats somebody negatively. And there's now substantial research that shows that Native Americans often face discrimination in schools, individual discrimination, teachers mistreating them, their peers mistreating them, and school can become a hostile space when that happens, right? Similarly, healthcare, I think the figures I read were like 40% of Native Americans, something around, it's really high, say they have experienced discrimination based on being Native in the healthcare system. So, you know, similar to how Latinx and African American experience discrimination in housing, in employment, around 25 to 50% of the time in many studies. This is happening to Native people too, right? In various institutions. And the stereotypes and prejudice associated with it undergirds that. There's also structural barriers. There's pretty much no Native treaties that have been completely adhered to. They're pretty much all been broken by the US government and citizens. And that's a structural problem, right? You make an agreement, a written agreement, nation to nation, and then you violate it, okay? And so that's a contemporary problem. Native rights to, you know, as I was mentioning, in sovereignty, Native societies, Native nations have a right to construct their own laws, to construct their whole criminal justice system. And there's recently been cases, legal cases, that have gone both for and against Native rights to be able to persecute people that commit crimes on their reservations. Native people and non-Native people have been in cases. These are Native lands, they have sovereignty, and people are in the wider society are fighting against Native rights to protect their own people, including missing and murdered Native women, okay? And so,
Have
go ahead,
hand
Justin.
raised?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, again, sort of a current thing that's going on in terms of treaty rights. The Mi'kmaq people, also called Micmac people in Nova Scotia, are currently really having a very difficult time with white fishermen who have been attacking them, cutting their lobster traps. They set one of the lobster pounds where the Mi'kmaq people store their lobster for, not only for family, but to sell on a minor commercial scale. Set that on fire. They set a Native woman's van on fire. They intimidate people that are buying lobsters from Mi'kmaq fishermen. Now, the crazy part to me about this is the commercial fishermen get to have over 350,000 lobster traps in the water. Mi'kmaq fishermen have been issued 5 licenses, which comes to about, I think it's maybe 350 traps, but only about 150 of them are being used. And these white fishermen are saying, oh, the Native people, they're overfishing and they're causing a problem and they're affecting our livelihood. Now, the treaty states that, it's the Treaty of 1728, I believe, that the Mi'kmaq people have a right to hunt and fish for a moderate livelihood, which does not mean that they can get rich. It just means that they can support themselves and their families through fishing and hunting. And the Canadian government has not stepped in. The RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, has been at some of these situations and said, oh, we're outnumbered, we can't get involved. And just to kind of put it in context, the world views Canada as a much less racist place than the United States. So if these are the things that are going on, and there's all kinds of crazy things. The murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls thing. There's a highway in Canada that is specifically named that, you know, this is where Native women go missing. To put it in a ratio, like we have hundreds of millions more people than Canada. And we have a similar history in terms of colonization. So to understand that these things are still going on, while living in this sort of weird thing where you want to see us in a historical context, but you don't want to honor the historical treaties. You say the law there's the supreme law of the land, but you also don't follow the treaties, which were legit nation-to-nation legal documents. So I just wanted to add that so that people can, you know, look into this if they want to know about things that are currently going on in terms of treaties and sovereignty.
Yeah, that's excellent. And, you know, there are Native scholars like Justin and other Native scholars that Springfield College could bring in to deliver lectures about a huge array of topics that we have not done, right? And I would like also to add some, you know, right now, the US is about to go drill in part of Alaska in the Arctic range, and Native people there are have been working against that for a really long time, and it's in a really critical period right now. And that that the US can kind of overrun Native interests and Native demands is part of this structural problem. Also, let's consider, since we're in this time period, how non-Native people vote. I'm going to make this claim without any research findings, which I don't usually do because I'm a researcher. But I would suspect that the vast majority of non-Native people, when they vote, they don't investigate what the position of various candidates are on critically important Native issues, including tribal nation sovereignty and many other issues, and they just ignore those issues. And recently, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you know, there's been a kind of outpouring of respect for her, but she wrote a decision that was really harmful to the Oneida tribal nation, and resulted in the Oneida tribal nation not being able to, they purchased land, put it into Native land status. And so a lot of people that are like, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg fans don't realize, you know, what people do or don't do. She's also had a recent good decision for Native people, but, you know, don't think about Native people and don't investigate and then vote in ways that are sometimes harmful to Native people. So just a couple more things. I know we're going to the end, and then we can talk about, we'll have a little bit of discussion left, but I want to cover two things. So besides stereotypes, there's a ton of other misleading information out there that is taught in the schools or conveyed in other ways. And earlier, Justin was mentioning Thanksgiving. I mean, there were lots of Thanksgivings that the colonists had in early US history, in the early colonial period, I mean. And a whole bunch of them were to celebrate massacres and killing Native people, and then having a Thanksgiving celebration after that, including the Pequot massacre. There was a big celebration in Massachusetts about that among the colonists. Further, conveying that Thanksgiving was like Native people and white people getting along is completely misleading. That is not the main thing that happened during colonization. And so, you know, that's why there's a day of mourning event every Thanksgiving period in the Plymouth area. And so in addition to the stereotypes, there's just a whole bunch of misleading information. So let me just talk about one reason why these stereotypes and these myths continue to exist. I mean, the obvious reason is Native people don't have enough voice to like counter these things. They don't have enough power to influence the dominant culture. But also they make whites, I'm white, they make whites feel really good. Here's some recent research findings. When whites are exposed to Native mascots, either pictures of them or a person with a Native mascot on their t-shirt, it increases their self-esteem. When whites, it was a recent experiment that was done, one white had a t-shirt on with a Native mascot, one with a different mascot that wasn't a Native person, and one with a blank shirt. The whites in this study liked the guy, the experimenter who had the Native mascot t-shirt on more than the other person was the exact same person in a different t-shirt with different participants. They liked the person with the Native t-shirt on. Also, when whites who have a greater belief in that noble stereotype you mentioned before, the romantic one, but also the degraded one, where Native people are seen as criminal and bad families and so forth. And also people who think that Native people are vanished, this stereotype about Native people being a people of the past, those people feel more warmth toward whites. So this is really complex, deep stuff, but there's a lot of white American attachment to these stereotypes and to these myths that makes whites really resistant to giving up this stuff and to recognizing reality. But whites that do, okay, understand Native issues and are, less engage in less of this stereotyping and engage in less of this mythology and are more supportive of stories, accurate stories of Native people and colonization, they are more apt to support Native rights. And so it's really important to get through all this stereotyping and mythology to get to the truth so that allies of Native people that don't take over but support what Native interests are and Native nation interests are especially, that we can be supportive without leading. So I just wanted to end by thinking about some ways, we got about 15 minutes, that things that non-Native people can do to support Native nation rights and Native nation interests and Native people's interests. So I'm not quite sure how we want to do this. Why don't we have kind of some blue hand raising, and let's start with that so that everybody can kind of engage in this part of it. What are we going to do about the stereotypes? What are we going to do about the myths? What are we going to do about the microaggressions, the individual discrimination, the structural barriers, people not thinking when they're voting or not investigating when they're voting? So this is a pretty big, we started at 66, now we're down to 55. Actually, we only have about 8 minutes, and then my host is going to interrupt. But what, Bill.
Hi, thanks, Laurel, for this. I'm not doing this necessarily to promote myself here, right? But one thing that I noticed I was really trying to focus on over the past year, right, is thinking about some of the sovereignty issues that both you and Justin brought up regarding, especially COVID, right? And it's like particularly devastating effects, especially on Native communities, right? And so I've been really trying to focus some of my my money, because that's sadly what I have the most to give right now, in really trying to direct those towards both specific tribes, and also groups, legal aid groups and stuff that are working specifically with tribes, right? This is one of the things that I've been trying to consciously work on recently. What I find what I find just so hard, right, is trying to incorporate it more regularly. I'm not a scholar of Native American history or literature at Laurel, as I think you know, right? And so one thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to increase my attention to it by trying to think about some of the same problems as they affect, for example, Aboriginal Australians, right? Which I'm teaching some literature by Aboriginal Australians right now, and trying to think about some of the overlaps of it, right? And what I've found is I'm having a lot of trouble with certain kinds of resistance in classroom discussion around trying to get us to think about what on the page is very simple. And I'm wondering how much of it is related to our discomfort in examining our own histories. So I've just been thinking about that while I've been teaching this semester.
Thank you. And I would like to just say, I think donations are really important. There's, you know, some great organizations working really hard on things like the Native American Rights Fund that needs a lot of money because there's a lot of court cases out there. So I think that, and they work a lot on sovereignty, and some of the other organizations do too. Justin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there are organizations here in Massachusetts and throughout New England that people can donate to. MCNA, which is the Mass Center for Native American Awareness. They do a lot of different things. They help provide food and oil assistance for Native elders. They have a scholarship program for Native students. They do a lot of educational programming. There's also Alcomat Education Initiative, which they go in and they help schools develop curriculums and plannings. They were actually instrumental in helping UConn create a plan to hire more Native faculty and staff, as well as do some land acknowledgement work and land development work. In terms of health, there's Native American Lifelines that has an office in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, and they serve Native communities throughout Massachusetts to help with not only physical health, but mental health issues, and, you know, support for things like COVID and diabetes and, you know, educational information in that regard. So there's a lot of resources in state. If anybody wants to, you know, get some more information about that, just shoot me a message in the chat. I'll give you my email, and then, you know, we can connect that way. But I think to speak to the resistance, and I'll try to make this brief, I'm sorry, I talk a lot. To speak to the resistance, I think one of the underlying factors is people have a hard time because it forces them to recognize their culpability in the ongoing destruction, right? People don't want to feel like they're part of the problem. And when you put that in front of them, and it's pretty clear that the entire American system is based on the destruction of Native culture and the co-opting of their land base for mineral resources and the like. It forces us as Americans, and I say that separately from being an Anishinaabe person because I consider it dual citizenship, it forces us to look at the history in a much different light. It's not as polite, anywhere near as polite or as pleasant as history books have led us to believe. And when you have to challenge that, it's difficult for people because then they have to start thinking about all the things that they've been taught. And people like to think that what they know is right and solid. So that can be part of that resistance, I think.
That's great. And Justin, if you want to type your contact information in the chat, go ahead. Also, the land acknowledgement that I read is on a website that's available to anyone. And what the two of us did that made this website is, along with Julia Chevin's help, the technological help, we have tons of organization links on there, including the organizations that Justin mentioned. We have Massachusetts-based, national-based, all kinds of educational resources. So it's not just a land acknowledgement site, but a resource site. So if you want a link to that site, you can just email me at springfieldcollege.edu, and it's got lots of action related things. I think we have time for one more person, and then Danielle is going to take over. Or it might be Shannon taking over. I don't know who's taking over in a couple minutes. Anybody want to make one last comment? Or Shannon, are you gonna pop in here?
It looks like Justine has raised her hand.
Oh, okay. I didn't see a blue hand, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I raised my real hand. Thank
Well,
you.
there's 2 pages, so I don't see everybody.
I know I've been on that side of the screen before. So yeah, thank you for this session. And yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying and what other folks such as Justin have added. And I just want to add, so there's this really great documentary I'm sure you're aware of called Dawnland. And it's about the first ever Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States ever about anything. And it was a, formed in Maine. So it was a Maine commission, and they specifically, were looking at the ongoing and still very recent practice of forced removal of Native children from Native families and into the foster care and adoption system, and the genocidal practice of placing Native children into white families in particular. And this documentary is amazing. First of all, it's just an amazing documentary. So I highly recommend it. But it's also, I think, this question about like, what are some actions? And I think part of it is just really looking at our own professions, right? And what in our professions is a part of that, those systems of exclusion and even genocidal practice. And in that case, the social work field, the field of social work, which, really sort of ironically, is seen as a helping. So it has sort of bound in it this kind of sort of ironic contradiction that you've been talking about, right? Which is this like, this sort of white saviorism and trying to help people, but really, having a genocidal consequence. So.
Okay, so I am now, I was told that you're gonna do feedback survey, and Shannon Fields, who is helping out in this session, has posted that in the chat. So before you leave, if you could take care of that, that'd be great. And Lisa has a hand up. You got to unmute yourself.
I have a really quick question. What are your thoughts on purchasing Native jewelry and then wearing Native jewelry?
I don't think that I should be a person to speak on this. I think it should be Native artisans. But I do know that Justin can jump in, that it's extremely important to know who you're purchasing from, and to support them financially in a substantial way, not an inexpensive way. Justin, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I'd like to speak to this as a Native artist myself, and just for people to understand that wearing jewelry is fine, as if you're not wearing it to sort of promote yourself as a Native person. But obtaining jewelry from Native artisans is entirely fine. I mean, that's how many of them support themselves and make a living. There's a thing called the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990, which states that in order for something to be called Native or have a particular tribe's name associated with it, the person selling it or who has it billed as such has to be a member, or has to be a member of a federally recognized tribe, or they have to have a certificate from a particular tribe verifying them as a Native artisan of the style of that particular nation. If people are interested in being able to find Native artists, jewelry, visual arts, etc. I'm on the board of directors for what's called the Social Distance Powwow, which is a Facebook group with over 211,000 members in 100 countries. And we have a section called the Facebook Social Distance Powwow Marketplace. And it is specifically a place for Native artisans from tribes all over the United States and Canada, as well as South America, South and Central America, to promote and sell jewelry, clothing, traditional style items, drums, flutes, etc. But yeah, it's really important to try to, as best you can, investigate who made the artwork. Locally, Firehawk Studios, my aunt Amalia, she has some really amazing things from, you know, home decor to high-end jewelry. But it can be difficult to track down who made jewelry. So wherever possible, going to Native events and buying directly from people at those events is my best suggestion. Buying things online can be difficult because there's no way to really track who created it and who's selling it and under what circumstances. So again, like I said, though, the social distance powwow, we do have things in place to regulate and vet our vendors to make sure that they are properly representing themselves and that the items that they're making are legitimate. Hope that was helpful.
Okay, well, I thank you everybody for attending. And you can get in contact with Justin or myself if you have other questions. Amalia is great. Okay.
Can I just make a plug for Justin's artwork? I think I have some of his pieces, and I encourage you, as we think about community partners, to purchase some of his art or take a look at it as well. I have to put that plug in for him.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.